Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope everyone has been having a great week. So today we're going to be talking about the unsolved case of the Oakland County child killer, also known as the babysitter, also called the babysitter killer. The murders have also been referred to as the snow killings. There are a lot of names associated with this case, but most people who have actually heard of this case just know it as the Oakland County child killer case. And this one really isn't well known and it's not really covered here on YouTube very much. But if you are from Michigan, chances are you have heard of this case, especially if you were alive in the 70s, which is when this case takes place. The Oakland County child killer case is one of the most interesting, baffling, frustrating, and absolutely horrific cases I've ever heard of. During 1976 and 1977, 4 children ranging in age from 10 to 12 years old were abducted, held captive for several days, and then murdered just hours before their bodies were discovered. And then their bodies were placed very deliberately in well-traveled areas around Oakland County. The children had all been fed and taken care of, not that they're actually taken care of because they were being held captive and some of them were sexually assaulted. But what I mean is they had been fed, they had been housed, they had been kept clean in the days leading up to their murders. That's why the perpetrator in this case is sometimes called the babysitter, because the kids had seemingly been cared for to some degree while they were being held captive.
State and local police say they have no one man under suspicion yet, but they think he lives and works in Oakland County, is a trusted member of the community, and not just some ragged loiterer offering candy to kids.
Like I mentioned, this case is still technically unsolved, but there is so much evidence that points to a group of people who were involved in a pedophile ring in the Detroit area at that time. And I really went down a rabbit hole when I was researching this case. There is so much information. There is so much evidence in this case, including some evidence that points to a potential cover-up by the state, allegedly. And while I was researching this story, I realized that it was really 2 cases rolled into one, because there was actually another horrific crime unfolding not far from Oakland County at the same time as the Oakland County child killings were happening. And it is believed by a lot of people that the other horrific crimes were linked with what was going on with the kids in Oakland County. And I tried to figure out how to tell this story without making the video too long or packing too much information into one. And so I did decide to break this one up into 2 parts. It was just way too much information for one video, but I promise that you will not have to wait long for part 2. Before we get into today's case, I'd like to thank today's sponsor, Care Of. Care Of is a subscription service that ships high quality, personalized vitamin supplements and powders conveniently to your door every month. I've been using Care Of for a while, but before I started using their products, I would get really overwhelmed when I would have to buy vitamins and supplements, stuff like that. There are so many choices out there. I would spend a lot of time just roaming down the vitamin aisle and basically having to Google pretty much everything to figure out what I was supposed to take and how much of it I was supposed to take. But Care Of takes the guesswork out of choosing the right vitamins and supplements because they've already done the research for you. You just go to the Care Of website, you take a short in-depth quiz about your health goals, your lifestyle, and then you'll get your personalized doctor-backed recommendation. And everything will be shipped directly to your door. And you can even retake the quiz anytime if you feel like your needs have changed. I'm currently taking 2 multivitamins with iron, rhodiola for stress, and collagen for my hair, skin, and nails, and I'm also using the vanilla whey protein. Your vitamins will come in these cute little packs, and these really motivate me to take my vitamins every day. The packs have your name on them and a little inspirational quote or motivational challenge, so it's actually kind of fun to take your vitamins every day. And these little packs are so much more convenient than having a bunch of vitamin bottles, especially if you're someone who has to travel a lot. You can just toss some of these into your luggage and you're on your way. Care Of also offers powders like collagen for skin, nails, and hair health, and they have whey protein to help fill in those nutritional gaps. They also have an app, and you can use the app to track your experience, like how you're feeling over time, so you can just kind of keep track of any significant changes you might notice. I've been using Care Of products for almost a year now, and I have 0 complaints. It's easy, it's convenient, and it keeps me from aimlessly roaming down the vitamin aisle. And you can get 50% off your first month subscription with Care Of by going to takecareof.com and enter promo code SUMMER50. You can also check my description box for that link, or you can scan the QR code on the screen right now. Thanks again to Care Of for sponsoring this video, and now let's jump into the case. This nightmare began in Oakland County, Michigan, in a suburb of Detroit called Ferndale. On February 15th, 1976, a 12-year-old local boy named Mark Stebbins was walking home from the American Legion Hall where his mother worked as a bartender. Mark had been up at the American Legion Hall that day watching a pool tournament with his 15-year-old brother Michael, and his mom was actually working there that day on her shift as a bartender. The boys had been there for a while watching the tournament, and Mark was starting to get a little bored and he was just ready to go. And so he asked his mom if he could walk back home. Ruth was still in the middle of her bartending shift, and Michael wasn't quite ready to leave just yet. But Mark was desperate to go home soon because there was a movie on TV that day called Destination Tokyo, and it was going to be airing soon, and he really wanted to watch it. Destination Tokyo is a war movie starring Cary Grant, and this movie was right up Mark's alley. He loved all things military, he collected lots of little toy soldiers, and he just loved anything to do with war or the army in any way. He actually had plans to become a Marine when he grew up. So he really had his heart set on watching this movie that day. And since Ruth and Michael weren't quite ready to leave just yet, he asked for permission to walk home alone. The walk home was only a few blocks away. The house was less than a mile from the American Legion Hall, and this was happening in broad daylight. It was only 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so Ruth felt like it was safe to let Mark walk home. So Mark says goodbye to his mother and his brother Michael, and he walks out of the American Legion Hall. And this would sadly be the last time that Ruth or Michael would ever see Mark alive. Later that afternoon, when Michael returned home from the American Legion Hall, he realized that Mark wasn't there. Michael thought that it was a little strange that he wasn't there yet, but he could have been anywhere. He could have been outside playing with friends. He could have been roaming around the neighborhood. He wasn't really alarmed just yet. It wasn't until his mother Ruth called later to check on the boys that concern really started to set in. Ruth was still at the American Legion Hall working her shift, and she called to check in on Michael and Mark. And after she spoke to Michael, she asked to speak to Mark, but Michael told her that Mark wasn't home. In fact, he hadn't seen him since earlier that afternoon at the American Legion Hall. Ruth was a little concerned, but she wasn't panicked just yet. She told Michael to start calling Mark's friends to see if anyone had seen him that day, which Michael did do, but no one had seen Mark. And when Ruth finally got home and Mark still wasn't there, she and Michael knew that something was wrong. And so at 11 o'clock that night, Ruth decided to report Mark missing. Ruth had divorced Mark and Michael's dad. I think his name was Lester. They had divorced years earlier. And so she was raising the boys by herself. I think Lester wasn't even living in the state. I want to say that he was living in Texas. And so money had been really tight. You know, Ruth was doing her best. She was working at the American Legion Hall. She also had like a waitressing job, and she was trying her best to provide for her children, but they did struggle quite a bit with money. And so when police asked Ruth for a recent photo of Mark so that they could make flyers, you know, post his photo on the news and in the newspaper, she didn't have a recent photo. Ruth hadn't had the money to purchase the school pictures in the last couple of years. So they ended up putting Ruth with an artist so that they could come up with a composite sketch of Mark. Ruth told police that Mark had strawberry blonde hair, blue eyes, he was wearing Levi jeans, a maroon sweatshirt, a blue hooded parka, and black rubber boots on the day that he went missing. So police made a ton of flyers. I think it was like 5,000 flyers, and they distributed them all over Oakland County. The police went door to door asking questions. They were searching parks and neighborhoods. The Shrine Circus was in Detroit at the time, so the police even went to question the circus people to ask them if they had seen Mark and to, you know, kind of look around to see if maybe Mark was hiding somewhere. They didn't know, you know, maybe he ran away and he was going to join the circus. But there was absolutely no trace of Mark anywhere. No one had even seen him walking that day. The area where Mark was likely abducted was near 9 Mile and Woodward Avenue. And this was a well-traveled area of town. There were businesses and stuff all around the Legion Hall and on the walk towards the Stebbins house, but no one saw him. Or if they did, no one came forward. It was literally like Mark had just vanished into thin air. Then 4 days later, a horrific discovery was made in the city of Southfield, just 3/4 of a mile from the Stebbins home. At 11:30 a.m. on February 19th, a man was passing through a parking lot of an office building where he was working, and he spotted something on a snowbank near the corner of the parking lot. At first, he thought someone had dumped an old mannequin in the snow, but as he got closer, he realized that it was the dead body of a child. He immediately called the police to report what he had just found, and the police pretty pretty much instantly knew that this was Mark Stebbins. Mark had been placed there on his back. He was fully clothed in the same clothing that he had been abducted in. The hood to his blue parka was up over his head. His hands were placed on his chest. And it didn't look like Mark had just been haphazardly dumped there in the parking lot. It looked like he had been deliberately placed there. He had markings on his neck, his wrists, and his ankles that indicated that he had been bound with ropes at some point. And he had been repeatedly sexually assaulted and then strangled to death. But what was really weird about this scene was that Mark had been fed. He'd been bathed. He was actually like squeaky clean. They couldn't find a trace of semen or anything on his body. He didn't look like he had been through a struggle or kept out in the elements or anything like that. Someone had kept Mark somewhere. It looked like someone had been taking care of him for the last 4 days. And he had been killed right before his body had been discovered, like just hours before he had been discovered. So this means that Mark was abducted, then someone held him captive somewhere for 4 days, assaulting him throughout the duration of those 4 days, and then drove Mark to Southfield where his body was found. They killed him, and then they placed his body in a parking lot in the snow, a place where people would easily find him, a place where he would easily be discovered. And they found out later that at 9:30 that morning, so remember, Mark was found at 11:30 that morning. But at 9:30 that morning, there was a man who had been walking his dog right around the area of that parking lot. And his dog was on a 20-foot leash. And the dog was roaming around the parking lot. And he never acted like he had found anything strange. He wasn't trying to sniff or dig at anything. And the dog's owner said that if that body would have been there at 9:30 that morning, his dog would have alerted him somehow. And then the man who had been working in the office building walked out to the parking lot at 11:30. That's when the body was discovered, and the body was easily discovered. So that means the killer had to have placed Mark's body there in the parking lot sometime after 9:30, but before 11:30 that morning. Super short window of time, really, when you think about it. And again, this was not an isolated area. The area where Mark's body had been found was literally right next to a strip mall, and the parking lot belonged to an office building, and lots of people were coming and going at all hours. And somehow no one saw anything.
No specific suspects. We're looking into a lot of background of a lot of people who have got backgrounds of this type of offense right now.
So the search for a killer was on, and since Mark had been sexually assaulted, police knew that they were dealing with someone who may have a criminal past involving sexual assault. Maybe this person was already in the system for crimes against children. And they found out that a 34-year-old man named Arch Sloan had recently been released from prison for sexually assaulting a child in Pennsylvania, and he was currently living in Oakland County in Southfield, which is where Mark's body was discovered. And Southfield is only 6 miles from Ferndale, where Mark was abducted. Arch Sloan was currently working in the area as a tow truck driver in Farmington Hills, which is another nearby city in Oakland County, and the person who tipped police off about Arch Sloan was actually a parole officer. There was no proof that Arch had been involved in Mark's murder, but since Mark had been sexually assaulted, the parole officer thought that it was a good idea for police to at least look into Arch Sloan. So investigators start looking into Arch, and they don't see anything that really jumps out at them at first, at least, aside from the fact that he is a known sexual predator, but they can't find anything that links him to Mark Stebbins. But they do decide to go ahead and take some hair and fiber samples from his car, and they put them in storage for later testing if they ever needed them, and just store that information away for now. So the days go by, and there are no leads into Mark's murder investigation, and eventually days turn into weeks turn into months, and still nothing. And people start to think that maybe this was a one-off thing. This was just something really tragic and baffling that happened to one of the kids in the community, and that was that. But then on Wednesday, December 22nd, 1976, so about 10 months after Mark's murder, another Oakland County child suddenly disappears without a trace. 12-year-old Jill Robinson was home that evening with her mother Carol and her 2 younger sisters, and Carol would later say that something was just off with her that night. Jill had been having some attitude problems in the months leading up to her disappearance, but her parents had recently divorced. She was attending a new school. There were a lot of big changes happening in her life, but Jill was a really good student. She was very smart. She absolutely loved to read, and she loved to cook and bake with her mom. She was very, very close with her dad, and she was struggling with her parents' divorce. You know, it was hard not having her parents together anymore and not seeing her dad all the time. And Jill had also been having some disturbing thoughts in the months leading up to her abduction. Her mother said that she had been having these premonitions that she was going to be shot to death. And Jill became fixated on this premonition, and she would often cry to her mom about it. She was really, really worried that this was actually going to happen, that someone was going to shoot and kill her one day. And she became so fixated on this thought that Carol took Jill to a child psychiatrist. And after speaking to Jill for a while, the psychiatrist said that, you know, she was fine. She was just a normal preteen girl. She was just going through some tough times, I guess. And they suggested that her mom get her a cat, I guess, as some sort of emotional support. So Carol did get Jill a cat. She named it Fluffy, but she was still struggling. You know, she was still having some attitude problems at home, and her mother were just kind of butting heads. And so Carol starts to confide in her boyfriend, a guy named Ted Radinsky. She had just started dating this guy, and she starts telling Ted about all the problems that she was having with Jill. She tells him all about, you know, the attitude issues and everything. And Ted tells Carol, look, the next time that Jill acts like that, you should tell her to just go outside, gather herself, you know, get her emotions under control, and then she can come back inside and try again. She can start over. And Carol later said that this is something that she never intended to do. It's not the way she would normally parent. It wasn't her style. And so she just kind of put this advice at the back of her brain. But on the evening of December 22nd, something was just up with Jill. Like I said, she was just in a bad mood. And Carol was trying to get dinner ready early that evening so that she could make it in time for church. So Carol asked Jill if she would help her make the biscuits for dinner, you know, to just help her speed things up so that she can make it in time for church. But Jill was refusing to help. And this is something that Jill did often with Carol. She would help Carol make the biscuits all the time. She liked to bake, she liked to cook, but she just wasn't feeling it that day. And Carol didn't really get mad at Jill. She just wanted to know what was going on. She was like asking her repeatedly, like, Jill, what is going on? Did something happen at school? Did you get in a fight with one of your friends? Like, something is wrong here. You need to talk to me. But Jill just kept refusing to say anything. And Carol remembered that advice that her boyfriend Ted had given her. And so she decided that she was going to try this new tactic. It went against everything she would normally do, but she was kind of desperate. She really wanted to get Jill's attention, so she just decided to try this out. So she says, Jill, I want you to go outside, take a breather, gather yourself, and then come back in when you're ready to talk. Carol later said that as she was saying this, like as the words were leaving her mouth, it just felt wrong. It was like an out-of-body experience for her. This is not the way she would normally handle Jill, but she was desperate to get her attention. And so she tried this new tactic. And this didn't go over well with Jill at all. It just pissed her off. She went to her room, she grabbed her backpack, and she put a couple of books inside. She put a brush in there. She put a green and blue plaid blanket inside, and then she headed for the front door. And as Jill was walking towards the door, Carol kept trying to stop her and say, Jill, you know, like, just forget what I said. You don't have to go outside. Just talk to me. Like, tell me what's going on so that I can help you. But the entire time, Jill was just walking right past her, and she was ignoring her mother. She wasn't answering her. She wasn't saying anything. So Carol decided to just let Jill cool off. And she assumed that Jill would just go sit out on the front porch and kind of brood for a little while, and she would be fine in a couple of minutes, and then she could come back in. But when Carol went outside to call Jill in for dinner 10 minutes later, she was gone. Carol didn't panic just yet. She knew that Jill was upset and that she was likely headed to her dad's house in the nearby city of Birmingham. It wasn't very far from Carol's house, and she also noticed that Jill's bike was missing, so she just figured that she was riding her bike to her dad's house. And like I said, Jill is very close with her dad, so Carol knew that that is where she would be headed. Carol decided to just go ahead and go to church that evening, and then she figured that Jill would be back by the time she got home. But when Carol got home from church, Jill still wasn't there. Carol drove over to her ex-husband's house. His name is Tom Robinson. By the way, I can't remember if I told you guys that, but Jill's dad's name is Tom Robinson. So Carol drives over to Tom's house and she asks him if Jill is there, but she wasn't. They drove all around town looking for Jill. She went to her friends' houses. She checked with family members. She searched neighborhoods, parks, alleyways, literally anywhere they could think of, but there was absolutely no trace of Jill. So at 11:30 that night, Carol called the police to report Jill missing.
I haven't seen her since, and I wasn't really very worried for an hour or so because she's very stubborn, and I thought she'll stand in the next yard and think about it, or go around the block or something, and then I thought maybe she went to visit her father. And so I wasn't very concerned for a couple of hours, and then I got in the car and drove around and tried to find her, and that's when I called the police.
Has she ever done anything like this before?
No.
Police initially just dismissed her. They told Carol that it sounded like Jill was just a runaway and she would come home soon. But Jill's family knew that this was not like her. She would never stay out at night like that by herself. They knew something was seriously wrong. And when Jill didn't return home by the next morning, Carol and Tom were in a full-blown panic, and police started to take them more seriously. They took a photo of Jill and they got her description so they could make flyers and alert the media. Carol said that Jill was wearing a denim jumpsuit, a bright orange parka with a blue hat, and snow boots, and she was also carrying a Levi's denim backpack. Police took Jill's most recent photo, the description, and they just plastered the area with flyers. The information was released to the media. There was a huge search for Jill. And someone did actually come forward and say that they had seen Jill riding her bike in the direction of her dad's house the evening that she disappeared. They saw her riding near 13 Mile Road and Woodward Avenue and heading towards Birmingham, which is the city that her dad lived in, and that was around 7:30 that night. Remember this location, specifically Woodward Avenue, because it comes back up, and if you remember, Woodward Avenue is the area that Mark Stebbins was likely abducted. So a couple of days go by and there aren't really any leads into Jill's disappearance, and there's no sign of her.
Somebody found Jill. It's okay.
And by the time Christmas Day arrived, any hope that Carol and Tom had that Jill was actually like hiding somewhere, that she maybe had actually run away, those hopes were gone. They knew how excited Jill had been for Christmas. She would have never missed Christmas. She had managed to save up enough money to buy each of her sisters a Christmas present that year. She bought one of her sisters a little Barbie hairdryer, and for her other sister, she got a stuffed animal, and she already had the gifts wrapped and under the tree, and she was so excited to give these gifts to her sister. She was just excited about Christmas in general. So her parents knew that it was an ominous sign when she didn't show up that day.
Mrs. Robinson is especially worried because today, Christmas, is something that Jill was really looking forward to. She had saved enough money from her allowance to buy gifts. Gifts that still remain unopened.
And the day after Christmas, Carol and Tom got the news that they had been dreading. Jill's body had been discovered in a nearby town called Troy. Someone had been driving down I-75 when they spotted something bright orange in the snow on the side of the road, and it was the body of Jill Robinson. They had spotted Jill's orange jacket. She had been placed there in the snow near the edge of the road, right out in the open for everyone to see. And this location that she was placed was within sight of the Troy police station. She was fully dressed in the same clothing that she had last been seen wearing, the denim jumpsuit with the bright orange parka. She was even still wearing her backpack, and the only things that were missing from inside the backpack were the 2 books that she'd placed in there before she left. And Jill had been shot in the face at close range with a 12-gauge shotgun, and the killer had shot her right there in the exact spot where her body had been found. And the fact that Jill had been shot makes this case even more tragic because that was her biggest fear. She had those premonitions that she was going to be shot to death, and that's exactly what happened. And I think that this fact probably made this all that much worse for Jill's family because they knew how scared she was of being shot. The time of Jill's death was determined to be between 2 and 4 a.m. that morning that she was discovered. The killer or killers had driven Jill to that location. They carried her from the car to the spot where she would later be discovered. They laid her down in the snow and fired one single shot 6 to 10 inches from her face. And then her body was discovered that morning at around 8:30. Her body was very clean. Jill had not been sexually assaulted. And of course, police noted the similarities between Jill Robinson's murder and the murder of Mark Stebbins immediately. Jill had been held for 4 days, then murdered right before her body had been found. She had been fed, she had been bathed before her murder, and she had been placed right out in the open where people could easily find her. Some of the investigators wanted to immediately link the murders of Jill and Mark. They knew that this had to be the same person or people doing this. But some investigators thought that the fact that Jill had been shot while Mark had been smothered to death, and the fact that Jill hadn't been sexually assaulted but Mark had been, meant that the cases weren't linked. Jill's bike was found the day after her body was discovered. It was found by some kid from the neighborhood where Jill lived in Royal Oak. It was found behind a grocery store. And Jill's body had been found in a totally different city. She was found in Troy. So either Jill rode her bike to that store before she was abducted, or whoever took Jill dumped the bike there. And the police barely got started on Jill Robinson's murder investigation when another Oakland County child was abducted. On January 2nd, 1977, just 1 week after Jill's body had been found, 10-year-old Kristine Mihalik was abducted from the city of Berkeley. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page, because I keep throwing out different city names, all of these kids are being abducted from Oakland County in Michigan. They're all from different cities, but since all of their cities are within Oakland County, they're all close together. Like, all these abductions are happening within a pretty close proximity. So Kristine Mihalik was a 10-year-old girl living in Berkeley with her mom, Deborah Ascroft, and her stepdad, Tom Ascroft, and her 3 younger siblings. The morning of Kristine's abduction, she had been at home with her family that day. She had spent the morning helping her mother take down Christmas decorations. They took all the ornaments off the tree, got everything packed and put away. And after the work was done, Kristine asked her mom if she could walk to the 7-Eleven to get a teen magazine. One of Kristine's Christmas gifts that year was a record player, and she also got the Donnie and Marie Osmond album Disco Train, and she was obsessed with it. And she knew that the latest issue of this magazine was going to talk about Donnie and Marie, and she really wanted to pick up this magazine so she could read it. She was so excited to read all about Donnie and Marie. So she asked her mother, Deborah, if she could walk the 4.5 blocks to the 7-Eleven to pick up the magazine. And Deborah actually told Kristine no at first because she didn't want her to have to cross this really busy street to get to the 7-Eleven. But Kristine just kept begging her to let her go. And she said, I did you a favor. I helped you with the Christmas decorations. So can you do this favor for me and let me go pick up this magazine? And after a lot of begging, Deborah eventually finally relented, and she gave Kristine permission to run down to the 7-Eleven and grab the magazine. But she told her she had to come right back, and she also made her promise that she would walk down to the light and cross the street there at the crosswalk. Kristine agreed that she would do this, and at 6:30 p.m. she grabbed her money and she set out for the 7-Eleven. And this was sadly the last time Deborah ever saw Kristine alive. It was later discovered that Kristine did actually make it to the 7-Eleven that evening. She purchased her magazine and she left. And at some point after she bought that magazine, Kristine was abducted. So when Kristine didn't come home after about 30 minutes or so, Deborah was already getting scared, and she called the police to report her missing. And by this point, because of the other abductions in the area, police took this very seriously. They were not waiting around to see if Kristine made it home on her own. They started searching immediately. So they announced that Kristine was missing that same night on the news, and the investigation got underway immediately. Tons of officers started searching for Kristine. They scoured the city of Berkeley, looking all over for her. Her stepdad, Tom Ascroft, was so upset that he grabbed a gun and he started driving around at all hours of the day and night looking for her himself. Kristine's family were doing press conferences, begging the abductors to let her go. Helicopters started circling around the area. Police were trying to get an aerial view of farms and wooded areas and stuff. The locals organized searches on foot. The local schools were doing presentations, talking about safety tips, and they were handing out pamphlets and stuff on stranger danger. Parents stopped letting their kids go really anywhere alone. They were waiting at the bus stops with their kids to make sure that they got on the bus in the mornings. They were waiting at the bus stops after school to make sure that they got off the bus okay and they walked home with them. Many kids weren't allowed to play in their own yards because their parents were so terrified that someone would snatch them up. And it wasn't just the parents who were scared. The kids were terrified that they might be the next victim. Kids were literally writing into news stations begging them to find the person responsible for the abductions because they were so scared they couldn't sleep at night.
It will be a week tomorrow since Kristine Mihalik disappeared while coming home from this store. In those 6 days, the community has come to realize that a missing child in this area is not merely the problem of the parents. Most of those out collecting funds today have families also.
Yeah, sure.
This was an absolutely terrifying time for the citizens of Oakland County, Michigan, and it was about to get even worse. On the morning of January 21st, 1977, 19 days after Kristine had been abducted, her body was discovered by a postal worker in Franklin Village. This postal worker was doing his morning route that day when he saw something blue in the snow near the road, and as he approached, he could see a little hand. Kristine's legs were kind of bunched up close to her chest. It looked like she had been carried in like a cradling position. She had been meticulously cleaned and then smothered to death right before she was placed on the side of the road in Franklin Village. Again, right out in the open where anyone could find her. And she had been dead for less than 24 hours when she was found. She was still wearing the same clothing that she had been abducted in, which included a blue jacket. So Kristine had been held captive for 19 days before the killer or killers murdered her. But again, her clothes were perfectly clean, even down to her underwear. The medical examiner concluded that, like Jill Robinson, Kristine had not been sexually assaulted. And the investigators at first thought Kristine had been forced to bathe and then dress herself before being murdered. But Deborah said that that couldn't be the case because the way the clothing had been put on Kristine was not the way that she would normally wear it. She would never have tucked the bottom of her pants into her boots, which is the way they found the body. So this meant that someone else had dressed Kristine, maybe after she was murdered. And one comment that Kristine's family made once she was found, they said that the abductors probably held Kristine for 19 days because she was just such a joy to have around, and they just couldn't bring themselves to kill her. She was just such a good kid. Everybody loved Kristine, and this was a huge blow to the community. And of course, police saw the similarities between her murder and the murders of Jill and Mark. And now they knew that they had a serial child killer in their midst, and the children of Oakland County were being hunted. And this, of course, just added to the hysteria that was going on in Oakland County. People were freaking out. They were terrified. And the largest task force in U.S. history was formed to find the person or people who were doing this.
In the Southfield Police Department, a task force was formulated. There were approximately 35 detectives from the following departments participating: Troy, Ferndale, Southfield, Berkeley, Royal Oak, Bloomfield Township, Birmingham, Oak Park, Franklin, Oakland County Prosecutor's Office, Oakland County Sheriff's Department, Michigan State Police, and the FBI. These 35 investigators from those agencies have formed a task force primarily to investigate and solve the Mihalik homicide.
A group of detectives from various jurisdictions around Oakland County got together and investigated all of the known sex offenders in the area, and there were thousands of pedophiles living in the Detroit suburbs and Detroit itself. They questioned over 4,000 sex offenders in the area, and they were about to get their most promising lead yet. A few weeks after Kristine Mihalik's body had been found, another horrible crime against a child was reported. A 13-year-old boy from Flint, Michigan had reported that he had been sexually assaulted on numerous occasions by two men, and their names were Gregory Greene and Christopher Busch. And to put it plainly, these two were the worst of the worst. They were absolutely vile human beings. They were both sadistic pedophiles, and they just happened to meet each other one day, and they bonded over their twisted, sick fantasies about hurting and raping young boys. Gregory Greene had started out his life of crime just stealing random things here and there. He was in and out of jail all throughout his teenage years. His mother had died when he was 16, so he really started to spiral after that. He started acting out, and stealing, I guess, is what he turned to in the beginning. But unfortunately, Gregory Greene just got worse. By the time he was in his early 20s, Gregory Greene was working as a janitor at a Kmart in California, and he worked the night shift at this job. And during the day, he would coach a Little League baseball team. And I'm sure that you know exactly how that went. By 1974, Greene had been reported for 45 counts of child molestation, kidnapping, and false imprisonment. 45 counts. And when Greene was picked up, he confessed to sexually assaulting at least 200 boys in his lifetime. And keep in mind that Gregory Greene is in his early 20s at this point. But that's not all. He had also nearly killed a young boy when he was violently choking him while he was sexually assaulting him. He choked this boy so badly that he fell completely unconscious. So in an attempt to wake the boy up, Gregory Greene started burning him with lit cigarettes. And when the boy didn't wake up, Greene started to panic. He thought that maybe he had accidentally killed him. So he threw the kid in the car, he drove to a nearby hospital, and he dumped this boy's half-dead body into a ditch. Then he bolted and went to a payphone to make an anonymous call to the hospital that there was a boy outside. I guess he panicked and he just wasn't ready at that point to cross over into murder territory. The boy ended up living through that whole ordeal, so that's at least one bright spot in this case, I guess. Greene ended up getting 6 months in prison and 6 months in a psychiatric hospital for those crimes, which is honestly such a joke. Like, this man was obviously sick. Like, he was extremely dangerous dangerous and he was only going to get worse. But Gregory Greene did his time and he was released in 1976. And after he was released, he moved back home to Michigan, which is where his dad lived. He flew from California to Michigan on February 11th, 1976, and Mark Stebbins was abducted just a few days later on February 15th, 1976. So eventually, once Greene was settled back in Michigan, he got a job, and while he was working this job, he just so happened to meet Christopher Busch. And it's just really unfortunate that these two ever met because they fed off of each other. And Christopher Busch is a very, very important person in this case. He was born in Michigan in 1951, and he was born into an extremely wealthy family. He was the youngest child of Harold Lee and Elsie Busch. And Harold Lee, or H. Lee as he's usually called, was a very prominent person in Oakland County, really the entire state of Michigan, to be honest. He was the financial director for General Motors, or GM. The Busch family lived in an upscale area of Birmingham, Michigan, and when Christopher grew up, his parents bought him a restaurant in Alma, Michigan, and the restaurant was called The Scotsman, and this was his job, running the restaurant. And Christopher was well known in the area because he owned The Scotsman and because of who his father was. Everyone knew the Busch family, and from the outside, everything seemed great with this family. You know, they had lots of vacation homes. The dad had this like super successful job at GM, and GM, I believe, was like the most important business in Michigan at the time. It might even still be, I don't really know. But I know at the time it was big. Like if you were an executive at GM, you had made it. But as Christopher Busch grew up, he started having a very disturbing attraction to young boys. By 1976, the year that the Oakland County child killing started, Christopher had already sexually assaulted several young boys. And it seems like for the most part, you know, even whenever these things would be reported to the police, nothing was really done. It sounds like Chris was never really held accountable for what he was doing, and it likely had a lot to do with who his family was, who his dad was. His dad had the money to make things go away. He had been accused openly of assaulting young boys for a long time, and he never spent any jail time. And if he did spend any time in jail, it was like a day or two. And a lot of people believe that because Christopher Busch was the son of a prominent GM executive, he got special treatment. You know, his dad was able to make all of these bad things go away. Then eventually Christopher Busch met up with Gregory Greene, and they were a match made in hell. They started sharing all of their dark fantasies with each other. They would talk about their plans to abduct a child and hold him captive for days. They wanted to kidnap a child, hold them captive, keep them as essentially a sex slave. And they talked about how they would make sure that one of them was always with the child at all times. So they would coordinate their work schedules where one of them would work the night shift while the other one worked the day shift. That way the kid was never by himself and somebody was always assaulting him. These two men were very, very sick individuals, and they did not need to be out on the street. They were both very violent, sadistic pedophiles. And eventually they started working together to lure in young teenage boys and then assault them. We don't know who all of their victims were. They had a lot of victims, but we do know that a 13-year-old and a 14-year-old boy from Flint, Michigan were both assaulted on a regular basis for a while by both Greene and Busch. And eventually the boys reported this to the police. Now, when this happened, when Gregory Greene and Christopher Busch were arrested, this was not long after Kristine Mihalik's body was found, like maybe days or like a few weeks. The assaults on these two boys, it occurred, like I said, several different times, and it had occurred in a few different areas around Michigan, so a few different counties. I guess they had like assaulted the boys in various locations around Michigan. And Christopher Busch's dad was so rich that he had a top attorney fly in on a private jet to all the different counties around Michigan where Busch was being charged. This lawyer's name was Jane Burgess, I don't know. And she flew on that private jet to all 4 counties, and she bailed Christopher Busch out of each of the counties. She just hopped one by one. They were having these hearings to like set the bond amount or bail. I'm not really sure what the difference is between those two, but whatever, the amount that they had to pay to like bond out of prison. They were setting those amounts, and this lawyer was flown in a private jet to all 4 of these counties to sit in on these hearings, and she would just slap down the money that was given by H. Lee Busch to bail or bond out his son. And the bond that was set by one of these counties was originally set at $75,000 for both Busch and Greene, and Busch's amount was reduced to only $1,000. And you can actually see the typed in numbers, like $75,000. It's marked out with a pen, and someone wrote in $1,000 next to it. But Gregory Greene, his amount stayed at $75,000. And he wasn't as lucky as Christopher Busch. He didn't come from a wealthy family, so he didn't get any special treatment. And Busch was only sentenced to like 5 years of probation. And while Christopher Busch only got like 5 years of probation, Gregory Greene was sentenced to life in prison. And keep in mind that these boys reported Christopher Busch and Gregory Greene for the exact same crimes. That's why it's highly suspected that Christopher Busch's dad, CFO of GM, pulled some strings and got his son off the hook. Harold Lee Busch was one of the elite in Michigan, and his wealth and power was very influential in the state. But Christopher's father wasn't the only rich, elite person he was connected to, and he, along with several of the other pedophiles around the area, would frequently travel to a place called North Fox Island. And North Fox Island was owned by a very rich and powerful man named Francis Sheldon. And Francis Sheldon was one sick fuck, and he turned North Fox Island into a haven for the most vile predators in the country. Think of North Fox Island as the original Epstein Island, and that should give you an inkling as to what this place was like. This island was described as a spider web of sorts for pedophiles to lure in and trap their victims. And all of the vile things going on North Fox Island started to come to light during the same time that the Oakland County child killer was still active. And just a couple of weeks after Christopher Busch had been allowed to walk out a free man, the fourth and final victim of the Oakland County child killer was abducted. And that is where I'm going to end part 1. There is so much more to this story. Like I mentioned in the intro, there are so many people and so many different side stories that tie into this case. I can't even get into everything. Part 2 will be out very soon. So if you are new to my channel, please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. Or maybe you are subscribed and you haven't done that yet. Go ahead and turn on notifications so that you'll know when I upload part 2. You can also follow me on Instagram at Sommer_SanchezYT if you want video updates and some random life stuff. Thanks again to Care Of for sponsoring this video, and don't forget to check the description box for the link and use my code SUMMER50 to get 50% off of your first order with Care Of. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.